Hello, welcome back. I'm Savalian, a software dev / creative, and today we're going to continue the critter modeling animation Unity series, and we're going to animate the bear that I've been working on. There's two videos before this one. There's a modeling video and a rigging video, and 3D animation follows a lot of the same sort of creative concepts as 2D animation. We will have keyframes where the skeleton that we built, our rig, will be in a certain pose and then move to another pose. And then in between those keyframes, we will also maybe have some in-between frames. But the benefit for us working in 3D is that we don't need to do every frame ourselves. We can do just a fewer keyframes and then the software can animate between them. The interesting thing is that we are not animating the mesh technically. We are animating the rig or the armature, and since the mesh is connected to the armature from the rigging work that we did, the mesh gets moved as a result of that. So before we start moving things around, it's a good idea to get familiar with our rig. We do animation in pose mode always. This is important. If you try to move bones in edit mode, it will not actually do anything until you leave edit mode, and then all hell will break loose because you're moving like the actual position of the bones in the skeleton. But go into pose mode and you'll see the rig controls from Rigify are all color coded. So we used the wolf rig in Rigify. If you use the slightly different rig, don't worry. The widgets that they use are the same, like they look the same for all the different kinds of meta rigs, so you should be able to follow along pretty well even if you used a different one. And going through these controls, if you want to move the entire object all at once, there's a big control on the ground. It looks like a circle with some arrows coming out of it. That's sort of the root bone. That's where everything starts. If you move that, it moves the entire mesh. If you just want to move sort of the central body mass, the hips and the chest all together, the big yellow cube near the hips can do that for you. And here's also where you'll see the effect of some of the IK settings that I mentioned briefly in the rigging video. So if you double tap A to select all the bones, you should see a bunch of like options in the side panel. And some of these options are called IK stretch, which I mentioned before. This is basically if you move the controls for the feet away from where the feet naturally end, do you want the mesh to continue stretching out, or do you want them to stop at the length that the legs are? Personally prefer to turn IK stretch all the way off, but you can sort of play around with these and see how you feel. The rubber tweak is hard to demonstrate on my character since mine doesn't have feet, but basically what this does is that if you have a hand or a foot that is rotated, it will add a sort of rubbery bend into the arm where it's connected. I don't really know what the purpose of this is or why it's on by default. Maybe I just don't quite understand how it works. But it always produces really strange, unusual shapes for me, so I always turn this off as well. And I mentioned the rubber tweak specifically because when I first started using Rigify, I was getting that weird movement and I could not figure out what was happening. I thought my weight painting was wrong somehow, and then eventually I found out that it was the rubber tweak. Now the IK targets themselves are some of the more useful controls. These are red and they are sort of a half circle, and these position the hands or the feet. So IK stands for inverse kinematics, which is a complicated name for something that's really not that complicated. So there's two ways to position bones that are connected in a chain, like an arm or legs. Forward kinematics means that you start at the top joint and you position that, and then you work your way down and you position that, and you work your way down and you position that. Inverse kinematics means it goes the other way. So instead of positioning things starting up at the shoulder, you position it starting at the hand. And depending on the pose you're trying to get, you may want to switch between these two modes, and you can do this by selecting the IK controls, and then there's a slider that says IK to FK. You can slide that, but this is an important thing. If you have one type of kinematic selected, and you move them, and then you want to switch to the other method, if you want the position to stay the same before you switch, you'll want to click either IK to FK or FK to IK, depending on which direction you're going. So basically, The FK controls are these green arrow controls, and then the IK controls are the red, the red hand and foot controls. And then we also have some little blue spheres that help us control sort of the direction of the different joints. These ones are kind of hard to work with because they really do a lot when you move them. Like, they really deform the mesh in some strange ways. But it can help if you have like a bent knee or something and you want to make sure the knee is pointing in a realistic way. You can move these blue circles. And then there's also some blue rings that kind of go up the spine all the way to the head. And these are for just sort of the base, like, the spine bones. It sort of adjusts the angle and the positioning of the core of the body. And so you can rotate or move those things to get the shape that you want there. And then if you left the tail on your rig, I didn't need the tail for this one, but you should have a control at the end of the tail that lets you curve it in different directions. Now that we know how to pose the creature, we need to set up our workspace here to actually make an animation. So, like I mentioned, animations are made up of keyframes over time. So first we need to find our timeline. I would recommend clicking the animation tab at the very top to switch into the layout that Blender has offered specifically for animating. In this layout you should see a timeline along the bottom, and it's actually made up of two different panels. There's a really skinny panel with the playback controls on it. In fact, if I pull that upward, we can see there's a timeline underneath there as well. But the animation layout has this additional panel above it called the dope sheet. I don't know why it's called the dope sheet. That's just what it's called. I assume there are animation related reasons for that, but I actually prefer to change this from the basic dope sheet to the action editor using the drop down in this panel. And that's because the action editor has controls to create and flip between different actions, so separate animations essentially. And before we make any actions, we want to make sure we have the rig selected and not the mesh, and that we are going into pose mode. This next step leads me to something important. This is important to remember. After we hit this new button to create a new action, we'll be able to give it to a name. And then next to this name, there's a little shield icon. You always want to click this for your animation actions. Whenever you start working on an action, Blender saves it to something called a data block. Blender sort of manages all these data blocks. They use them for materials and textures and other things as well. But basically, if there's not an active user of a given data block, Blender will delete it. I think it only does this when you save and quit, but we want to hit the shield icon to tell Blender we always want to keep this data block even if it looks like nobody's using it. Okay, that's the important thing. I don't know why Blender works this way, but it's worked this way for as long as I can remember, and I've been using Blender for actual decades. Now that we've got that out of the way, we will first want to make a base pose where every bone is keyed to its base position. This is really important for a few things. It's important for exporting. When we export the model from Blender, we want to be sure that the model is in its base pose. If we export it while it's in a different pose, it will consider that to be its starting pose, and then when we import to Unity and animate it, all the animations will look really bizarre. But also, as you're working through these different actions, this can be useful for resetting the bones so that if you go from one action to another one, it doesn't have the same kind of problem where it's starting from a different position. So we want to make sure when necessary we go back to that base pose before going to a new action to sort of reset it. Now let's talk about keyframes. Keyframes are the poses that make up an animation. You set up the keyframes and the animation will move from one to the next, smoothly interpolating, or if you change it, interpolating maybe not so smoothly. But there are two basic ways to add keyframes in Blender: by automatically recording them and by manually adding them. So to make the base action first, I'll name this something descriptive. It helps me in Unity to include an identifier for the model it's for. And then before I keyframe manually or move anything in recording mode, I want to make sure I'm on the correct frame. For this base pose, we really just need the one frame, and you can either click or drag on the timeline, or you can use the arrow keys to jump around between different frames. And the way we manually add keyframes is to select what you want to keyframe and then hit I. And for this one, because I want to key all the bones at once, I'm going to double tap A to select all the bones and hit I. And you probably have a lot of options here, like I do. You can keyframe a lot of different kinds of things. For animating models, really the things we want to worry about are translation, rotation, and scale. So I'm going to do all three of these for all of them, so I'll just hit that option here. And then in our dope sheet / action editor, we're going to see a bunch of these little yellow diamonds. These are all of our keyframes. And then down the side, we'll see a bunch of names. These are the names of all the bones that were set to each keyframe. For most animations, we will not want to keyframe every single bone. What we will want to do is just use the control bones. Because of this being the base pose, I really did want to get all of them in there. And since we didn't actually move anything, this animation will essentially do nothing. So we're going to hit the new action button that looks like a copying icon to sheets of paper, because it does copy the current action to make a new one. Next, we're going to make an idle animation, and I guess, you know, before this point, probably you'll want to look at some references. You'll want to have an idea, maybe a sketch of what you want this animation to look like. I tend to wing it for a lot of these just because that's how I roll. Sometimes I'll look up like a diagram of a walk cycle or something like that, but I tend to play it pretty loose. But going into it here, you'll want to be able to at least imagine how the mesh is going to move for the animation you want. For an idle animation, what I want is for the bear's body to gently rise and fall to give the impression that it is breathing. Now, one thing I noticed is when I select all the keyframes, either by hovering over the dope sheet and hitting A, or, you know, dragging to select which ones I want to delete, when I deleted all the keyframes, it did kick me out of the action, so I made sure I went in and selected that again. Now, for this, we can start using record if we want to. It's the button on the timeline next to like the play and the frame movement buttons, just like a little record, a little circle button. When this is on, whenever you move a bone, it will add a keyframe automatically. So make sure you're aware of that. You're setting it to the right frame before you move things and just kind of paying attention. I know I can sometimes forget. I'll do some moving and then realize I've added a bunch of keyframes I didn't really want. But I don't want to keyframe everything. I just want to start by selecting all of my like main control bones and adding a key to the start and the end of my animation. And I'll also decide how long I want this to be. I think a lot of the idles I've made so far are around 200 frames. Once I have keyed the pose initially, I can select those keyframes, clicking on the summary, which is a keyframe that sort of contains all the keyframes on that frame, if that makes sense. And then I can just do like a Control C, a Control V, or I think Shift D also works, and just move it to that end frame. And then that will create an animation that goes from frame 1 to frame 200, and it just maintains this pose the entire time. And the orange lines that come up between the keyframes show you that that frame is not changing. It's the same position at both ends. If at any point we want to see what our animation looks like, we can always hit space or the play button and it will start playing. And then another thing I'll mention is that the timeline has this start and end. These define where the playback starts and stops. It doesn't have any effect on the animation itself. It's just how many frames we want Blender to play for us when we hit play. And to get my idle animation going, I'm going to scroll ahead a little bit, maybe like a second or two. I think the animations play at 24 frames per second by default. You can change this in the output settings if you want. But I'll go ahead a second or two and I'll just move the hip sort of down a little bit. And there's not really much else to an idle animation. It's just that gentle movement that makes a creature look alive even though they're not actively moving. If you don't have any idle animation, depending on your game, it might not be noticeable, but it can make your characters or your creatures look a little bit like a statue. And then additionally, if you're modeling something like a person, you typically do that in like a T pose or an A pose where their arms are extended. And then in idle pose, you'll want to sort of relax the pose a little bit so they're not standing with their arms straight out. But for the bear, our idle pose is going to be very similar to, the pose that I modeled it in. And then once I've got a good timing on the idle part of the idle animation, I just want to add that head shake I mentioned. I'm just going to rotate the head back and forth a couple times and then put it back to neutral. And I'm going to put that somewhere in the middle, just at a random position. And then as this plays, we'll get a lot of repeats of just the breathing. And then once in a while, it will do the head shake. Now I think that's pretty good. We've kind of got a handle on how to add keyframes, how to move them around on the timeline. And now we can move on to something a little bit more advanced, a walk cycle. For most of the creatures or characters that you have in your game, this is like the bare minimum you're gonna need is a walking animation. Unfortunately for me, the walk cycle for animals is a little bit different for each one. They kind of have their own ways of moving, and then like some of them, like horses, have multiple ways that they move depending on how fast they're going. So I looked up a video of a real bear walking, and they kind of move their feet one after the other. The bear kind of lumbers, and I know that they can do a run as well, but mine's not going to be running. I also looked up just bear walk cycle, which you can also do for whatever you've made. I found a set of images with 8 main frames. There's basically one for the pickup and put down of each of the 4 feet. And it's not my image, I just found it on Google for reference, so I'm not going to share it here. But I would recommend looking for references for your animation projects. If you can get like an animation specific reference, that's even better because they tend to break things down into these keyframes for you. And then once I know what I need to do, I find it's often easiest to start with the most extreme poses, get those laid out and looking good, and then sort of go in and fill in the smaller pieces. So first I'm going to copy the idle animation, rename it to walk, delete the keyframes that I don't want. The first pose for this bear has the front right foot and the back left foot sort of fully extended, and the other 2 are kind of neutral below the body. This is the keyframe for the picking up of the rear left foot. So I'm going to start this on a frame near the middle because I find it's hard sometimes to do extreme poses on the looping points because it will do a sort of hiccup as it starts over with the next, like it starts over from the beginning. There's like a little delay. And as I'm positioning the feet, I also try to think about how the upper body is going to shift to get the foot into the position that it needs to be in. So you can do a little experiment with your own body. You can just see when you walk, notice how no part of you is like completely stationary in space. Your hips shift based on which foot you're sort of standing on. Your shoulders shift, maybe your arms swing a little bit. There's a little bit of a twist in your body as you move from foot to foot. So we want to think about where the weight is being put on each foot and how the upper body would change to sort of account for that. You can also use the digital aspect of Blender to your advantage by doing things like pasting a flipped version of the pose. So this only works if your rig has equivalent names for the right and left side of the body. Usually it's like a .L or a .R on the bone name. Rigify luckily does this for us, so we don't need to worry about configuring anything. But basically, if I have a pose, I can select those keyframes, Control C to copy it. I can go to a different frame, Control Shift V, or right click and paste flipped, and it will post the pose, but opposite. So like if the left foot was lifted up, the pasted pose would have the right foot lifted up. So now I have these two opposite poses of the feet extended fully out. If we play the animation at this point, it kind of looks like the bear is just sliding its feet back and forth. Now, depending on your game, if it's a very simple style, a very simple game, you might be able to get away with this. This might be enough for you, but we can do a little bit more to make the walking look more like walking. And so I'm going to do the next keyframe, which is the pickup of the right front foot. So this pickup keyframe is going to prevent it from doing that slide, and it's going to happen a little bit before the fully extended in the front, because the bear picks up the foot near the middle of its body, lifts it forward, and then that's how we get to that extended pose. And really just the animation process is about going through each of these poses, seeing how they lead into one another, and if you see something that doesn't look quite right, figure out if it's because one of your existing keyframes needs to be adjusted, or if you need an additional keyframe in between to handle the transition. At one point, I wasn't really happy with how the shoulders and hips were shifting, so I redid those, and after a little bit I realized I did not go back to the base pose and reset the position, so I had some rotation in the back half, the hip area, that actually wasn't from a keyframe, it was from that leftover animation. So once I went to the base and back, it sort of reset those, and now the body was aligned a lot more straight front to back, which is what I was looking for. And also with walking, there's usually some sort of like up and down movement. I'm not totally sure how that looks with bears, so I kind of went with my gut here. I was kind of thinking with the poses where the legs are extended, I figured they'd be higher up because they would be sort of propped up on those feet near the middle of their body. And then the transition poses where they're lifting their feet, they would be a little bit lower in their walk cycle. So how well you do at this depends a lot on practice. It depends a lot on how much effort you've put into finding references and studying the references, but if you get some sort of rhythm like this, it'll probably look good enough. Once I got the two front feet in their little loop being picked up and extended and dropping back down, I moved to the back feet. And as I do this, I'm always going back and forth between different views. I'm using the display view on the left. I can rotate and see how it looks without all the rig pieces getting in the way. Just make sure from every angle it looks right, and a lot of this is just playing it, letting it loop, looking at how it goes through the different motions and seeing if it looks natural. That's a lot of it, is using your gut. One of the things I noticed for mine was that I had the feet sliding out to the side a little bit as it was going through the step. I didn't think that was very realistic, so I went into the keyframes I had and I moved them so that the feet followed a more direct path from front to back as they moved. And also, if you find that the animation as a whole is a little bit too slow or a little bit too fast, you can select all your keyframes, hit S, and then drag the mouse to scale the animation to make it play faster or slower. But be careful in this one, it will set the middle of the scaling to wherever the seek bar is, whichever frame you're on. So if you want to do the entire thing evenly and have it start at frame 1, make sure you put the seek bar at frame 1 before you start scaling it up or down. After about 45 minutes, I think I've got the walk animation where I want it. These by far take me the longest because they're based so much on like real motion, and it's something that we can kind of see that something's wrong really easily with walking because of how our brains work. If it's a more like imaginary motion that we don't have a lot of like subconscious experience with, we might be more willing to let some unrealistic movement slide. But I feel pretty good about this one. This is kind of how I go through animations. They all go through this same process where I start with those big extreme poses and then I work my way through to the more neutral ones, the more like the little tweaks and things like that. But as you might expect, different animations are gonna work differently. So a walk animation is going to be a lot more focused on repetition and that natural movement, whereas a death animation is gonna be a lot more dramatic. There's gonna be one like big movement and then it's gonna stop in that final pose. It's not gonna loop. So just think about what you want to get out of your animation and how you want to accomplish it. I'm going to do a little time lapse of all the other animations that I did for this bear, because I do need a couple more for the game that I'm working on. They need to be able to do combat, and then we'll see how they all look at the end. But there's one thing I noticed that I didn't touch on until this point that may be helpful to you. But just a warning, I'm not very good at using this tool. I've only recently started trying to use it in my workflow, but we're going to talk about the graph editor. So the graph editor is a view where you can see the shape of the movement that a certain bone goes through its keyframes. So the way you get into the graph editor is actually on, it's an entire view. It's not within the dope sheet, it's its own panel, and from here you can hit normalize to make the different keyframes sort of fit within the view together. But you'll see the different positions of all your axes essentially. So you'll see X position, Y position, Z position, different rotations, different scalings. If you have other types of keyframes, I think they'll be on there as well. But what you can do in this view is you can select keyframes and you can change how the movement is interpolated between them. So this is where you get into stuff like easing for like 2D animation. Basically, if you're going from one point to another point, how quickly does that happen? Does it happen very quickly at first and then slow down? Does it happen to the point where it actually extends past it and comes back a little bit? That's like a bounce type of thing. This is how we change that. And so if you select 2 keyframes, or at least 2 keyframes, you can hit T and change the interpolation to get different looks. Like I mentioned, the default I believe is Bezier, where it has the handles on it. You can drag to make the curve more or less extreme. But you can research how these different interpolation types work. You can play around with easing, but I thought I'd mention it here. And then actually, as I was filming this video, I found out you can also set the interpolation mode from the action editor. So I'll probably never actually use the graph editor again. Honestly, it's just a little bit too expert level, a little bit too fiddly for my workflow, but I wanted to mention it because it can be very powerful for people who really get into animating, and I wanted you to know it was there. Okay, and then to get back to the action editor, remember that it's part of the dope sheet view panel, so you'll have to select dope sheet first, and then I think it should still have action editor selected in the sort of secondary drop down. Alright, now that we covered that, back to the little time lapse. Okay, here we are. I hope this video wasn't too long. There's a lot to animating in Blender, and I hope I covered all of it in enough detail that you can figure this out for yourself, but not so much that you got bored and stopped halfway through. So if you made it this far, congratulations. I'm glad that you found this video either helpful or entertaining, or hopefully both. Here are all the animations that I made for this bear. Basically, all of the creatures in my auto chess game that I'm working on have an idle, a walk cycle, basic animations for dealing and receiving damage, a death animation, and then 1 or 2 special moves depending on what sorts of things I've got planned for them. So for the bear special move, I did this little jump in the air followed by a body slam that I think is really cute. It's really gonna pop off when I get some like particle effects going in Unity for that, but just the basic movement for animation here. And I'm pretty proud of these. I think they look nice. So I hope that gave you a good overview of how to create multiple animations for a creature character in Blender. In the next video, we are going to actually export our creature from Blender and use him in Unity, and I'll show you both the settings to how to export it in a way that Unity can actually make use of, and then how to import it, what settings you have there, and then we'll also go through setting up the animator controller, because I know that's another thing that can be a little bit confusing for new people. So we're going to go through all of that in the next video, which, depending on how tricky it ends up being, maybe next week or it might be the week after. So stay tuned if you want to use your character in a Unity game. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and give the video a like. It really helps me out. I'll be back soon with another video, and I hope to see you there. Bye bye!